have always feel lost and uncertain about my future after a series of setbacks and rejections. One day, I meets an unlikely mentor, an elderly woman named Sophia, who teaches me the value of perseverance, creativity, and self-discovery. Before we get started, I just wanted to express my gratitude for being part of this journey with all of you. If these empowerment stories are inspiring you, join us for free and let's continue growing this amazing community together. Now, let's dive in. My name is Christie, and I used to believe that talent was everything. I used to think that if you were meant to be an artist, the path would unfold before you like a red carpet, smooth and inviting. I was wrong about so many things back then. I'm 24 now, and I've been painting since I could hold a brush. My mother likes to tell the story of how I painted my first masterpiece on the living room wall when I was 3, a chaotic swirl of purple and green that she swears looked like a storm. She kept a photograph of it, even after she painted over the wall. "Your first commission," she'd joke, though we both knew it cost her a can of primer and an afternoon of work. Growing up in a small town outside of Portland, art wasn't exactly a career path that guidance counselors pushed. When other kids talked about becoming doctors or teachers or engineers, I spoke about galleries and exhibitions. I dreamed of my paintings hanging in museums, of people standing before my work and feeling something profound, something transformative. But dreams, I've learned, have a weight to them. The heavier they become, the harder they are to carry. I remember the exact moment I realized that wanting something desperately doesn't make you entitled to it. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was standing outside the Hartwell Gallery downtown, staring at the rejection letter in my hands. The paper was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with the gallery's letterhead embossed at the top. The words were polite but final. "We appreciate your submission, but your work doesn't align with our current vision." It was my 15th rejection in 6 months. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my portfolio case alongside the others. I'd started keeping them all, telling myself it was motivation. But really, I think I was building a monument to my own inadequacy. Each rejection was another brick in a wall I was constructing around my heart. The morning air was crisp, and I could see my breath as I walked back to my car. Portland was waking up around me, coffee shops opening their doors, people hurrying to work with purpose in their steps. Everyone seemed to know where they were going except me. I drove home to my studio apartment, which was really just a one-bedroom with terrible lighting and walls I'd covered in my unsold paintings. My landlord, Mr. Peterson, had initially objected to me hanging artwork without his permission, but when he saw the pieces, he'd changed his tune. "Keep them up," he'd said. "They make the place look less like a prison cell." It wasn't exactly the endorsement I'd been hoping for. I spent that Tuesday afternoon doing what I'd been doing every day for weeks, applying to galleries, writing cover letters, polishing my artist statement until it gleamed with false confidence. I wrote about my unique perspective and my bold use of color, all the while wondering if I was deluding myself. That evening, I called my best friend Sarah, who was finishing her residency at a hospital in Seattle. "Another rejection," I told her without preamble. "I'm sorry," she said, and I could hear the genuine sympathy in her voice. "But you know what they say about rejections. If you tell me they're just redirections, I might scream." She laughed. "I was going to say they build character, but redirections works too." "I don't need more character, Sarah. I need someone to believe in my work." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sarah had been my cheerleader through art school, through my first attempts at showing my work, through every disappointment and small victory. But lately, I could sense her growing concern. "Maybe," she said carefully, "you should consider that the art world isn't the only place where creativity matters. You could teach, or do graphic design, or—" "I don't want to teach," I interrupted. "I want to create. I want to matter." "You do matter, Christie. Just maybe not in the way you thought you would." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by my paintings, and for the first time, I wondered if Sarah was right. Maybe I was chasing something that was never meant to be mine. Art school had been my sanctuary for 4 years. a place where being different wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. At Portland Institute of Fine Arts, I'd found my tribe among the other misfits and dreamers. We'd spent long nights in the studio, paint. My professor, Dr. Martinez, had a way of looking at student work that made you feel either like a genius or a fraud. There was no middle ground. I remember the first time he critiqued one of my pieces, a landscape I'd painted of the Oregon coast, all moody blues and grays with a single splash of orange where the sun broke through the clouds. Technically proficient, he'd said, which I later learned was academic speak for boring. But where is Christie in this painting? I see Monet, I see Turner. But where are you? I'd mumbled something about finding my voice, but the truth was, I wasn't sure I had one. All through school, I'd moved from style to style, like someone trying on different personas. Abstract expressionism for a semester, photorealism the next, then a brief and embarrassing flirtation with performance art that ended with me covered in chocolate pudding in front of a bemused audience of 12 people. My fellow students seemed to have an innate sense of who they were as artists. Jake worked exclusively in found materials, turning garbage into profound statements about consumer culture. Maria painted haunting portraits that seemed to peer directly into viewers' souls. Even Weird Thomas, who insisted on signing his name with a backwards S, had developed a distinctive style of geometric abstractions that professors called challenging and provocative. And then there was me, Christie the chameleon, changing colors to match whatever environment I thought would accept me. The problem with constantly shifting your artistic identity is that eventually you forget who you really are underneath all the imitation. By my senior year, I was creating work that looked like it could have been painted by any of a dozen different artists, all of them more successful than I was likely to ever be. My senior exhibition was titled Reflections, which seemed appropriate, given that everything in it was a reflection of someone else's vision. I'd painted a series of city scenes in the style of Edward Hopper, complete with the same lonely diners and empty storefronts. The pieces were well executed. I'd always been technically skilled, but they lacked something essential. They lacked truth. On the night of the opening, I stood in the corner of the gallery watching people examine my work. They nodded appreciatively, made polite comments about my masterful technique, but I could see it in their eyes. The work was hollow, beautiful, maybe, but hollow. Dr. Martinez found me near the end of the evening, when most of the crowd had dispersed, and I was seriously considering hiding in the bathroom until everyone left. "You know what your problem is, Christie?" he said, sipping wine from a plastic cup. I braced myself for another critique. "You're so busy trying to be the artist you think you should be that you've forgotten to be the artist you are." "I don't know who that is," I admitted. He smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "Then that's what you need to figure out. Because until you do, you're going to keep painting other people's dreams instead of your own." I graduated with honors, which felt like a consolation prize. My classmates moved on to graduate schools, artist residencies, gallery representations. Jake got into Yale. Maria was accepted to a prestigious program in New York. Even Weird Thomas landed a solo show at a trendy gallery in Los Angeles. And I moved back home, to a studio apartment and a growing collection of rejection letters. The transition from student to emerging artist was brutal. In school, I'd had structure, deadlines, feedback. In the real world, I had only myself and an increasingly critical inner voice that whispered about wasted potential and foolish dreams. I applied to every opportunity I could find: grants, residencies, group shows, open calls. I painted constantly, trying different styles, different subjects, different approaches. But nothing felt right. Every piece I created felt like an imitation of an imitation, a copy of a copy degraded beyond recognition. The art world, I discovered, was a closed system that favored connections over talent, networking over authenticity. Gallery openings were exercises in performance art, where what you wore and who you knew mattered more than what you painted. I attended them anyway, standing awkwardly in corners, nursing cheap wine, and trying to make small talk with people who looked through me as if I were transparent. I remember one particularly brutal evening at a gallery in the Pearl District. The featured artist was someone I'd gone to school with, a guy named Marcus, who'd always been more interested in his image than his art. His paintings were large, aggressive abstractions in black and red that seemed designed more to dominate wall space than to communicate anything meaningful. But he'd mastered the art of self-promotion. He moved through the crowd like a politician, charming collectors and critics with equal ease. His artist statement read like a parody of art speak, full of references to post-colonial discourse and the liminal space between being and becoming. I stood before one of his paintings, trying to find something, anything, that would help me understand why he was here, and I was still sending out portfolios to indifferent galleries. "Powerful work, isn't it?" a woman beside me said. She was older, maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and paint-stained fingers that suggested she was an artist herself. "I suppose," I said, though I wasn't sure I meant it. She studied me for a moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing more than I wanted to reveal. "You know," she said quietly, "the loudest art isn't always the most honest." Before I could respond, she'd moved away, disappearing into the crowd like a ghost. I looked for her the rest of the evening, but never saw her again. I left that opening feeling more lost than ever. If Marcus could succeed with work that felt empty to me, what did that say about the entire enterprise? Was authenticity even valued anymore, or was it all just a game of connections and marketing? That night, I sat in my studio apartment, staring at my latest painting. Another landscape, this one of Mount Hood at sunset. It was technically accomplished, pleasant to look at, utterly forgettable. I picked up my brush, loaded it with black paint, and drew a single line across the center of the canvas. It was the first honest mark I'd made in months. The gallery that finally agreed to show my work wasn't really a gallery at all. It was a coffee shop called The Daily Grind that rotated local artists' work on their walls monthly. The owner, a cheerful woman named Beth, who made the best lavender lattes in Portland, had agreed to give me a solo show for the month of October. "It's not the Met," she said apologetically when she offered me the space. "But everyone has to start somewhere, right?" I threw myself into preparing for the show with an intensity that probably worried my friends. I painted 12 new pieces in 6 weeks, working 18-hour days and surviving on coffee and determination. The work was the best I'd ever done, or at least I thought it was. The pieces were landscapes, but with a twist. Instead of traditional natural scenes, I painted urban landscapes with elements of nature breaking through. Vines growing through abandoned buildings, flowers blooming from cracked sidewalks, trees whose roots had lifted entire sections of pavement. I called the series Reclamation, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had something to say. Sarah drove down from Seattle for the opening, and my parents made the trip from their small town. Even Mr. Peterson showed up, wearing what I suspected was his only suit. I'd invited everyone I could think of, former classmates, professors, people I'd met at other gallery openings. I'd designed and printed invitations, posted on social media, taken out a small ad in the local Arts Weekly. I'd expected maybe 20 people to show up. 6 came. Sarah was there, of course, and my parents, looking proud but slightly bewildered by the whole thing. Mr. Peterson bought a small painting of a rose growing through a chain-link fence, which I sold to him at cost because I was so grateful for his support. A stranger named David, who turned out to be a blogger for a local arts website, spent 10 minutes looking at the work before leaving without saying a word to me. And that was it. I stood in the daily grind, surrounded by my paintings and the smell of espresso, watching people order their coffees and barely glance at the walls. I'd envisioned crowds, conversations about the work, maybe even a sale or two. Instead, I got polite smiles from caffeine-seeking customers and the gentle hum of indie music from the shop's speakers. "Yeah, it's beautiful work, honey," my mother said, squeezing my hand. "Really beautiful." But I could see the worry in her eyes. The same concern I'd been hearing in Sarah's voice lately. The unspoken question, how long are you going to keep trying? The worst part wasn't the low attendance or the lack of sales. It was the review that appeared on David's blog 3 days later. He'd titled it, Coffee Shop Art, The Dangers of Lowered Expectations, and it was devastating. Christie Morrison's reclamation suffers from a fundamental confusion about what constitutes meaningful artistic commentary, he wrote. The heavy-handed metaphors and technically competent but emotionally vacant execution suggest an artist who has yet to find her authentic voice. While the work might provide pleasant decoration for a coffee shop wall, it fails to engage with the complex realities it purports to explore. I read the review 17 times, each word like a small knife. Technically competent, but emotionally vacant. Pleasant decoration, failed to engage. I called in sick to my day job at the local art supply store and spent the next 3 days in bed, emerging only to eat ramen noodles and check my phone for responses to the review. There were a few supportive comments from friends, but mostly silence. On the 4th day, Sarah called. I read it, she said without preamble. And he's an asshole who doesn't know what he's talking about. Sarah? No, listen to me. You think Van Gogh got good reviews? You think every great artist was immediately understood and celebrated? That guy probably couldn't paint a stick figure. But what if he's right? I said, voicing the fear that had been eating at me. What if I'm just fooling myself? What if I don't have what it takes? The silence stretched between us for a long moment. Do you want to quit? She finally asked. I don't know. Maybe. I'm tired, Sarah. I'm tired of rejection and criticism, and feeling like I'm not good enough. I'm tired of living in this crappy apartment and working at a job that barely pays my bills while I chase something that might not even exist. So what would you do instead? I hadn't thought that far ahead. I don't know. Something practical, something safe. And would that make you happy? I laughed, but it came out bitter. I don't know what would make me happy anymore. That weekend, I went for a walk in Laurelhurst Park, trying to clear my head. It was one of those perfect October days when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air held the promise of winter. I found myself at the duck pond, watching families feed bread to the waterfowl despite the signs asking them not to. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, was drawing in a sketchbook while her mother read nearby. She was using crayons to capture the ducks, and her technique was exactly what you'd expect from a 5-year-old. Enthusiastic, imprecise, joyful. The ducks in her drawing were purple and orange, the water was bright green, and the sun had a smiley face. It was terrible and wonderful. That's beautiful, I said, sitting down beside her on the bench. She looked up at me with serious brown eyes. It's not very good, she said. The ducks don't really look like ducks. But they look like your ducks, I said, and that's what matters. She considered this for a moment, then went back to her drawing, adding more enthusiastic purple to one of the duck's wings. I watched her work for a long time, remembering what it felt like to create without fear, without the weight of expectation or the crushing awareness of judgment. When had I lost that? When had art become about everything except the joy of making something that didn't exist before? That night, I stood in my apartment, looking at the paintings from Reclamation. In the harsh light of the review and my own disappointment, they looked different. Still technically competent, still pleasant to look at. But David had been right about one thing. They lacked something essential. They lacked me. I picked up a brush and a tube of purple paint, the same wild purple the little girl had used for her ducks. And for the first time in months, I began to paint without worrying about what anyone else would think. 3 weeks after the disaster at the Daily Grind, I was sitting in Washington Park, sketching people who passed by and trying to remember why I'd fallen in love with art in the first place. It was one of those crisp November afternoons when the light seems to come from everywhere at once, and even though I was feeling sorry for myself, I couldn't help but notice how beautiful everything looked. I was working on a drawing of an elderly man feeding pigeons when someone cleared their throat behind me. "You've captured his loneliness beautifully, but you've missed his hope." I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, studying my sketchbook over my shoulder. She was probably in her 70s, with wild white hair that looked like she'd stuck her finger in an electrical socket, and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a paint-stained apron over a flowing purple dress and carried what appeared to be a tackle box covered in artistic stickers. "I'm sorry," I said, closing my sketchbook reflexively. "The man with the pigeons," she continued, as if we were in the middle of a conversation we'd been having for hours. "You've drawn his bent shoulders, the careful way he portions out the breadcrumbs, the way he holds himself apart from the world. All the loneliness is there. But look," she pointed toward the man, who was now laughing as a particularly bold pigeon perched on his outstretched hand. "See how his eyes light up when they trust him enough to come close? That's the hope you missed." I opened my sketchbook again and looked at my drawing. She was right. I'd captured something true but incomplete. "I'm Sophia," she said, settling onto the bench beside me without invitation. "And you're the young woman who had that coffee shop show a few weeks ago." I felt my face flush. "You saw the review?" "I saw the work," she corrected. "The review was written by an idiot who couldn't recognize authentic searching if it bit him on his pretentious behind." Despite everything, I laughed. "You're being kind." "I'm being accurate. Your work has problems, but dishonesty isn't one of them." She opened her tackle box, revealing an impressive collection of brushes, paints, and drawing materials. "Mind if I sketch while we talk? These hands get restless when they're not creating." I nodded, fascinated in spite of myself. "What kind of problems?" "You're painting what you think you should paint instead of what you need to paint," she said, pulling out a piece of paper and a stub of charcoal. "Your technique is solid, maybe too solid. You've learned all the rules so well that you've forgotten why they exist in the first place." "Which is?" "To help you break them more effectively." She began sketching rapidly, her hand moving across the paper with practiced confidence. "Tell me, why do you paint?" It was such a basic question that I almost didn't know how to answer it. Because I have to? Because it's who I am. Those are the answers you think you should give. What's the real reason? I watched her sketch for a moment, trying to articulate something I'd never really examined. Because sometimes I see something or feel something, and it's so intense, so important, that I need to make it exist outside of myself. Like if I don't paint it, it might disappear forever. She nodded approvingly. "Better? And what have you been painting lately?" "Landscapes, mostly. Urban decay, nature reclaiming spaces. Safe subjects, pretty subjects, subjects that won't reveal too much about who you are." She held up her sketch, and I gasped. In just a few minutes, she'd captured not just the pigeon man, but the entire scene. The dappled light through the trees, the scatter of breadcrumbs, the other park visitors lost in their own worlds. But more than that, she'd captured something I hadn't even noticed. A young mother watching her toddler chase falling leaves, and in her expression, a complex mixture of joy and melancholy that spoke to the bittersweet nature of watching someone you love grow up. "How did you see all that?" I asked. "Practice, and willingness to look at things that matter, even when they're uncomfortable." She tore the sketch from her pad and handed it to me. "Keep this. When you're ready to stop painting landscapes and start painting truth, look at it again." I took the sketch, still amazed by what she'd accomplished in such a short time. "Are you a professional artist?" She laughed. "What's professional about art? I make things because I can't help myself. Sometimes people buy them, sometimes they don't. The important thing is that they exist. Where do you show your work? Wherever it wants to be shown. Coffee shops, libraries, friends' living rooms. The walls don't make the art, dear. The art makes the walls worth looking at." A pigeon had wandered over to our bench, eyeing us hopefully. Sophia pulled a small bag of seeds from her tackle box and scattered a few on the ground. The pigeon pecked at them gratefully. "You know what your real problem is?" she said. "I'm afraid to ask. You're so worried about being good that you've forgotten about being brave." She looked at me directly, and I felt like she was seeing straight through to the core of me. Good is technical. Good is competent. Good is what they teach you in school. Brave is what makes people stop in their tracks and feel something they didn't expect to feel. But if you're not good, then you learn to be good. But if you're not brave, all the technique in the world won't save you from mediocrity. She began packing up her supplies. "I have to go. I'm meeting someone for coffee and I'm already late." She stood, shouldering her tackle box with surprising ease for someone her age. "Wait," I said. "Will I see you again?" She smiled, and there was something almost mischievous in her expression. "That depends. Are you ready to start being brave?" Before I could answer, she was walking away, her purple dress billowing behind her like a flag. I sat on the bench for another hour, looking at her sketch and thinking about what she'd said. The drawing was simple, just charcoal on paper, but it pulsed with life in a way that my carefully constructed paintings never had. She'd captured not just what things looked like, but what they felt like. That evening, I stood in my apartment looking at my easel, which held a half-finished painting of the Portland skyline. It was competent, pleasant, utterly forgettable. Everything Sophia had suggested my work was. I picked up my brush and mixed a color I'd never used before, a deep, unsettling purple that looked like bruised sky. Without thinking about composition or technique or what anyone might think, I painted a single figure in the foreground of my cityscape. A woman with her back to the viewer, looking up at the buildings with an expression of longing so intense it was almost painful to see. It was the first time I'd ever painted myself into a landscape. When I stepped back to look at what I'd done, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement. The figure didn't belong in the painting according to everything I'd learned about composition and focal points. It threw off the balance, demanded attention, made the viewer ask questions. It was imperfect and uncomfortable, and absolutely necessary. For the first time since my coffee shop disaster, I couldn't wait to paint again. I started looking for Sophia everywhere. Over the next week, I haunted Washington Park, hoping to run into her again. I sketched constantly, trying to see the world the way she seemed to, with an eye for the hidden emotions, the untold stories, the hope that lived alongside the loneliness. It was Thursday afternoon when I finally found her, or rather, when she found me. I was at Pioneer Courthouse Square, attempting to draw the interaction between a street musician and his audience. The musician was playing guitar, his case open for donations, and I was trying to capture not just the scene, but the complex dance of need and generosity, performance, and authenticity that was playing out in front of me. "Better," said a familiar voice. "You're starting to look beneath the surface." I turned to see Sophia approaching, today wearing a bright yellow sweater that had paint stains in at least 6 different colors. She carried the same tackle box and had added what appeared to be a small folding stool to her artistic arsenal. "I've been hoping I'd run into you," I said. "Have you?" She settled onto her stool and opened her tackle box. "And what have you been hoping for?" "I don't know. Guidance, maybe? I keep thinking about what you said, about being brave instead of just good." "And what have you discovered?" I showed her my sketchbook, filled with drawings from the past week. Street scenes, coffee shop interactions, moments of human connection and disconnection. They weren't perfect, but they were more alive than anything I'd drawn in years. She flipped through the pages slowly, nodding occasionally. "You're beginning to trust your eye," she said finally, "but you're still holding back." "What do you mean?" "These are all observations of other people's emotions. When are you going to start exploring your own?" The question hit me like a small punch to the chest. I don't know if I'm ready for that. No one ever is. That's what makes it brave. She pulled out a brush and a small canvas, no bigger than a postcard. "Tell me about your biggest fear." "My biggest fear?" "As an artist. What terrifies you most about creating?" I thought about it for a moment. That I'll pour myself into something and it won't matter. That I'll reveal everything I am and people will look right through it, like it's invisible. Ah. She dipped her brush in water, then in paint. The fear of insignificance. Very common, very human, very paintable. You want me to paint my fear? I want you to paint through your fear. There's a difference. She began working on her tiny canvas, mixing colors I couldn't even name. Fear is just another material, like paint or charcoal. You can let it paralyze you, or you can use it to create something powerful. I watched her work, mesmerized by the confidence of her strokes. Even on such a small surface, she was creating something complex and layered. The painting seemed to be abstract at first glance, but the longer I looked, the more I could see figures emerging from the swirls of color. "How long have you been painting?" I asked. "Longer than you've been alive," she said without looking up. "I started when I was 7, the same age as most children when they decide they can't draw. The difference is, I kept going." "Did you go to art school?" She laughed. "Eventually. But school can only teach you what's already been discovered. The important stuff, the stuff that matters, you have to find on your own." "How?" "By paying attention, by being willing to fail spectacularly, by caring more about truth than approval." She added a dash of yellow to her canvas that somehow made the entire composition come alive. "By making friends with uncertainty." A group of teenagers walked by, laughing loudly at something on one of their phones. Sophia paused in her painting to watch them, and I saw her expression soften. "Look at them," she said. "So alive, so present. They're not worried about whether their laughter is sophisticated enough or whether their joy fits current aesthetic trends. They're just being. But they're not creating anything. Aren't they?" She gestured toward the group. "They're creating a moment, a memory, a connection. Art doesn't only exist on canvas, Christie. Sometimes the most profound art is simply being fully human in the presence of others." This was a completely different way of thinking about creativity than anything I'd learned in school. Art as a way of being, rather than a product to be consumed. "I think I've been approaching this all wrong," I said. "How so?" "I've been trying to make art that looks like what I think art should look like. But maybe I should be making art that looks like what I actually see, what I actually feel." "Now you're beginning to understand." She held up her tiny painting, and I gasped. In the abstract swirls, I could now clearly see the street musician, his audience, the complex web of human need and connection that I'd been trying to capture in my sketch. But more than that, I could feel something in the painting, a kind of longing that seemed to pulse from the canvas. "It's incredible," I said. "It's honest," she corrected. "There's a difference. Incredible suggests something beyond human experience. Honest suggests something essentially human." She handed me the painting. "For your wall. A reminder that small can be powerful if it's true." I took the painting, still amazed by what she'd accomplished in such a short time. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." She smiled, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something almost sad in her eyes. "Because I recognize something in you, a hunger, a need to create that's stronger than your fear of failure. It's rare, and it deserves nurturing." "But surely there are other young artists who—" "There are many people who want to be artists," she interrupted. "Fewer who need to be artists, and even fewer who are willing to do the difficult work of discovering what that means for them specifically." A breeze kicked up, scattering leaves around our feet. Sophia packed up her supplies with practiced efficiency. "Same time next week?" she asked. I nodded eagerly. "What should I work on?" "Paint your worst day," she said. "The day you most want to forget. Don't try to make it pretty or meaningful or anything other than true. Just paint what it felt like to live through it." The suggestion terrified me. "I don't think I can do that." "Then you're definitely ready," she said, walking away with that same mysterious smile. I sat in the square for a long time after she left, holding her tiny painting and thinking about worse days. There were several candidates, but one stood out immediately. The day I'd realized that being talented wasn't enough, that the world didn't owe me anything just because I could create things that looked like other things. It was the day after my coffee shop opening, when I'd woken up to that devastating review and understood that all my dreams might have been delusions. That night, I stood in front of a blank canvas for 2 hours before I found the courage to make the first mark. When I finally did, it was a slash of dark blue across the center, the color of 3 a.m. despair, of lying awake wondering if you've wasted your life chasing something that was never real. It was the beginning of the most honest painting I'd ever attempted. The painting of my worst day took me 3 weeks to complete, and it nearly broke me twice. I worked on it only late at night, when the rest of the world was asleep, and I couldn't pretend that anyone might see what I was creating. The canvas became a dumping ground for every fear, disappointment, and moment of self-doubt I'd accumulated over years of trying to be an artist. I painted the crushing weight of rejection, the way failure felt like a physical thing sitting on my chest. I painted the loneliness of working in isolation, the way other people's success felt like a personal attack on my worth. I painted the voice in my head that whispered fraud every time I picked up a brush. It was ugly, it was raw. It was the most real thing I'd ever created. When Sophia saw it the following Thursday, she stood in front of it for a full 5 minutes without saying a word. We were in my apartment this time. She'd asked to see my studio space, and I'd been too curious about her reaction to refuse. "This," she said finally, "is what courage looks like." I felt tears threatening. "It's terrible." "It's necessary." She moved closer to the canvas, studying the way I'd layered the paint, the places where I'd scraped and reworked and built up texture. "You've painted pain, but you've also painted survival. Look here." She pointed to a section where, without conscious intention, I'd added small areas of lighter color, tiny breaks in the overwhelming darkness. Even in your darkest moments, you kept creating. That's hope, whether you recognize it or not. I looked at the painting with fresh eyes and saw what she meant. Despite the overall darkness, there were indeed moments of light, not cheerful or optimistic, but persistent, the kind of light that refuses to be completely extinguished. "I didn't plan those," I said. "The best parts are never planned. They come from someplace deeper than conscious intention." She sat down on my couch, looking around at the other paintings on my walls. "May I tell you something about my own worst day?" I nodded, settling into the chair across from her. "I was 35, she began, and I'd been painting seriously for about 10 years. I thought I was making progress, building a career, becoming the artist I'd always dreamed of being. I had a studio in New York, a small gallery representation, even a few collectors who bought my work regularly." She paused, and I could see her gathering the memory, deciding how much to share. One morning, I woke up and realized I hated everything I'd painted for the past 5 years. Not disliked. Hated. It all felt false, calculated, designed to please rather than to express. I'd become so focused on success that I'd forgotten why I wanted to succeed in the first place. "What did you do?" "I destroyed it all. 23 paintings, 5 years of work. I took them out to a field behind my studio and burned them." I felt my mouth fall open. "You didn't." "I absolutely did. My gallery was furious, my collectors were confused, and I was utterly lost. But I was also, for the first time in years, free.